Had Maori known of the existence of the rest of the terrestrial world in the 17th century, they might have found it strange, indeed unbelievable, that their isolation was about to be ended by citizens of small countries located on the opposite side of the globe. What about the neighbouring Polynesians with their former traditions of widespread ocean voyaging? What about the ancient culture of China, which as recently as the 15th century had possessed an enormous navy? What of the Tamils, the Moguls, the great civilizations of the Middle East, all of them older and geographically closer to the South Pacific than Europe? Why was it Europeans who were extending and attempting to take control of the known world? To all of which, of course, there is no easy answer. Most West European nations in the 17th and 18th centuries were gripped by an ethos of expansion, every bit as powerful as that which propelled Polynesians out into and around the Pacific in earlier centuries. But with that ethos, in the case of Europe, came a post-Renaissance explosion of learning in philosophy and science, an evolving maritime and military technology that allowed the export and movement of weaponry superior to that in other parts of the world, a sense of God-given racial and cultural superiority over other peoples, and an immunity to the diseases they carried, which had the power to lay waste peoples whose long isolation from the Eurasian continent meant that they lacked such immunity. To this volatile and powerful combination, reduced by one historian to the phrase, guns, germs and steel, Maori would eventually prove to be as vulnerable as the peoples of North and South and Central America, the continent of Australia, and the rest of the Pacific. Fortunately for Maori, and thanks only to the relative isolation of New Zealand and the vicissitudes of history, the full force of Europe's colonizing ethos did not arrive in one vast ocean swell. Instead, it was ripples of the waves from other centres of military, commercial and scientific activity that lapped New Zealand's shore. And that, initially, was a phenomenon with which Maori could cope. The first ripple, and with it the first opportunity to open a datable, chronological history of New Zealand, was an eddy of the commercial aspirations of the Dutch East India Company in the string of large islands north of Australia, then known as the East Indies. On the 13th of December, 1642, Abel Tasman, commander of a two-ship company expedition, sailed over the western rim of the sea that would eventually bear his name. "Towards noon," he wrote, "saw a large land, uplifted high, southeast from us about 15 miles, made our course, direct for it." What he saw was the mountainous west coast of the South Island, off a promontory now known as Perpendicular Point, a little north of Tumatakokiri. Tasman and his 110 sailors and soldiers were 121 days out of the port of Batavia, Jakarta in post-colonial Indonesia. They had sailed west to Mauritius, then east towards the continent of Australia, then known to Europeans only by parts of its northern and western coasts. Their instructions were to find the unknown southern continent, Terra Australis Incognita, which cartographers and geographers believed filled the southern centre of the Pacific Ocean to balance land masses in the northern hemisphere. But Tasman's primary responsibility was not cartographical. It was to seek opportunities for trade in gold and silver, spices and fabrics. And if the expedition discovered precious metals and minerals, Tasman was to represent himself not to be too eager for them in order to keep the wild savages unaware of the value of the same. Heading east from Mauritius, Tasman's vessels had managed to miss entirely the southern mainland of Australia, but did brush the south and eastern coast of the island, which the expedition called Van Diemen's Land, after the Governor-General of Batavia, but which would later be called Tasmania. There the crew found signs of human habitation, but failed to see the wild savages, who appear to have concealed themselves. In any case, the Dutchmen had been warned by their East India Company masters that no barbarous people are to be trusted, so you must always be well armed and carefully on guard. 8 days sailing from Van Diemen's Land, they then beheld the cloud-covered alpine spine of the island known to its inhabitants as Te Waipounamu. There too no wild savages took to the water to greet them, and indeed the coastline before them was harbourless and dangerous to ships under sail. The two vessels, Tasman's flagship, Heemskerk, and an armed transport, the Zeehan, then tacked north. 4 days later, about 2 kilometres off Whanganui Inlet, Tasman saw in various places smoke rise where fire was made by the inhabitants. This was the earliest indication that the expedition had been sighted by Maori, who were about to become, for the first time, characters in narratives other than their own stories. The following day, 18th of December 1642, the ships rounded the massive sickle of Farewell Spit and anchored in the bay Maori knew as Taitapu. We have no record of what the people there, Ngati Tumatakokiri, made of the spectacle of the three-masted vessels and their billowing sails. What they saw would have been as unfamiliar to them as extraterrestrials approaching in spaceships, and possibly as frightening. Up to this time they had had no reason to suspect that there were people in the world who looked different or who thought and behaved differently from themselves. According to their own stories, they were humankind and all of humankind. Who, then, were these strangers? For what followed we have only the accounts of the Dutch witnesses. Ngati Tumatakokiri, themselves originally invaders from the north, were attacked by waves of descending North Island tribes in the 18th and early 19th centuries and annihilated as an iwi. They left no descendants to transmit coherent versions of the first encounter between New Zealand Maori and European people, whose beliefs and technologies had propelled them halfway around the globe to discover, explore, assert and lay claim. The Dutch journals make the cause and course of what happened clear enough, however. In the thickening dusk of the 18th of December, 2 double-hulled canoes, packed with Maori, put out from shore to inspect the ships. They began to call out to us in a gruff, hollow voice, but we could not in the least understand any of it. They blew also many times on an instrument which gave sound like the Moors' trumpets. We had one of our sailors blow back to them in answer. Those of the Zeehan did likewise. Given what we know about similar encounters in the following century, it is likely that the locals were asserting their identity and mana and raising their own morale by challenging the visitors to fight. The Maori convention was to take the offensive in an uncertain situation so as to encourage themselves and discourage an adversary, and thus make their own survival more likely. It was by this time a long-established code of behaviour that would have been comprehensible to other Maori. It was not comprehensible to Tasman's men, however, who failed to recognise that a highly specific protocol had been set in motion. Dutch trumpeters from both vessels had returned the Maori calls made from pukaea, long wooden trumpets, imagining perhaps that this would establish a basis for congenial mutuality. In the Maori view, however, all that happened was that a challenge to fight had been issued and accepted. The outcome was inevitable, but as far as the Dutchmen were concerned, wholly unexpected. On 19th in the morning early, a vessel of this people having in it 13 men approached our ships. They were, as far as we could see, of ordinary height but rough in voice and bones. Their colour, between brown and yellow, had black hair, top-knots, right on top of the crown of the head, upon which stood a large, thick white feather. Their clothing was, so it appeared, some mats, others cottons, probably beaten bark. When the Zeehan's cockboat was being rowed from the Heemskerk back to its mothership, another canoe also containing 13 Maori rammed it. They dashed over the same violently, on which violence 3 of the Zeehan's people were killed, and the 4th, through the heavy blow, was mortally injured. After this detestable affair, we diligently fired our muskets and guns, but we did not hit them. The body of one dead crewman was taken ashore by Maori, possibly to be cooked and eaten, a ritual means of absorbing the mana of a vanquished foe. The first of many European imports consumed in New Zealand was a dead Dutchman, James Bellich would write. Tasman's instructions were specific about not engaging in warfare with local peoples, so he ordered his vessels to depart. "We could not expect to make here any friendship with these people." As the crews raised anchors and sails, however, 11 more canoes, swarming with people, pushed off from shore and came at them with speed. The locals clearly thought that they had gained the upper hand, and were keen to deliver the coup de grace. When the first canoe got close to the Zeehan, the Dutch crew began to fire at it, and felled a man standing in the bow, at which point the Maori flotilla dropped back and allowed the European vessels to depart without further pursuit. Sailing away, Tasman called the place Murderers' Bay. 200 years later, British settlers renamed it Golden Bay, not after the beaches on the southern shoreline replete with golden sand, but after an accidental discovery of gold in the area, the very metal Tasman had been instructed to give priority to finding. The Tasman expedition's merchant and artist, Isaac Gilsemans, drew a sketch of the mortal encounter, which, as an engraving, would eventually enter world literature as the first published representation of New Zealand Maori. To the modern eye, there is nothing especially Polynesian about the appearance of the men who fill the canoes. No women were sighted. This is not surprising. Gilsemans may not have been sufficiently close to the locals to recognize individual or detailed features. The faces, for example, are without tattoo. Other illustrations from the same voyage indicate that most of Gilsemans's human figures tended towards the generic rather than the specific. What is clear is that some of the canoes, lashed together, were double-hulled for greater capacity and stability. At least one had a triangular sail, and the men, some bearded, some not, had their hair pulled upwards in top knots. Most were naked above some kind of loin covering. One man standing, perhaps the person of authority who had been shot, wore some kind of cloak from the shoulders. Out of Murderers' Bay, the Dutchmen failed to confirm the existence of the passage of water between the country's principal islands, whose presence was suggested by a powerful flow of water. They sailed up the desert-like west coast of the North Island, sighting nowhere safe enough to risk a landing. There were harbours, including 2 major ones, the Manukau and the Kaipara, but Tasman was too far out to sea to recognise the entrances. Much of his map of this coast was reconstructed from sightings north and south of the features marked. Because of cloud cover, they missed Mount Taranaki, but did see Karioi south of Raglan. Gilsemans's coastal profile drawings, which accompanied the ship's journal, show that the crews did sight the opening of Kawhia harbour, but failed to investigate it as a potential entrance to sheltered waters. They did see Maori again, 30 to 35 of them, on the ridge of Great King Island off the northern tip of the North Island. The reported gigantic size of these figures may have resulted from the use of early Dutch telescopes, which were insufficiently refined to give an undistorted view. Again, crew members were unable to land, partly because of surf and currents, and partly, perhaps, because the now gigantic inhabitants, throwing stones and shouting at the Dutchmen, had become demonized in their European imaginations. And so they abandoned the country on the 6th of January 1643, without having once set foot on it. Tasman took his expedition north and discovered some of the islands in the Tonga group and others in the northern sector of Fiji. He eventually returned to Batavia via the northern coast of New Guinea. Having failed to step ashore on New Zealand, Tasman had no reason to suppose that it was the cornucopia of spices, precious metals and cloths that his principals in the Dutch East India Company had been seeking. Because of the supposed absence of exploitable and tradable resources and the apparently intransigent character of the inhabitants, New Zealand would be left to its isolation by the envoys of Europe for more than a century, though Tasman's map of the country's west coast, bearing, as one historian put it, some resemblance to a ragged question mark, would now appear on charts of the world. Its location there would tantalize navigators of the future and leave open the possibility that Terra Australis Incognita spread further east and inland from the littoral the Dutchmen had traced. Tasman called the new country Statenland, because he speculated that it might be the western extremity of the Statenland off the southwest coast of South America, named by his countryman Jacob Lemaire in 1616. When, late in 1643, this was perceived to be impossible, the South American location having been identified by Hendrik Brouwer as an island, an anonymous cartographer in the Dutch East India Company renamed Tasman's line of coast Nieuw Zeeland, or in Latin, Zeelandia Nova. This was clearly intended as a matching name for Hollandia Nova, by which the western coast of Australia was at that time known, Holland and Zeeland being neighbouring Dutch maritime provinces. Footnote: the eventual conversion of the Dutch name into English should have been New Zealand, spelt S-E-A, land. The spelling incorrectly adopted misled some commentators into supposing an historical connection with Denmark, whose principal island has also assumed the form Zealand in English. In 1990, a Maori activist, Tetewhai Harawira, went to the Netherlands to ask the Dutch authorities to reclaim the name New Zealand in order to facilitate the country's reversion to a Maori name. She was unsuccessful. In any case, there was no unanimity among Maori as to what that name should be. Returning to the text. It was over the name Zeelandia Nova that the newly recognized country appeared on European charts of the Pacific Ocean and the known world from the middle of the 17th century. By the late 18th century, this scratch of coastline would be identified variously as New Zealand, spelt Z-E-E, land, New Zealand, spelt Z-E, land, and eventually New Zealand. With Tasman's departure, the inhabitants of Zeelandia Nova had no further recorded contact with Europeans for another 126 years, sufficient time for the Dutchman's visit to recede into the mythology of Ngati Tumatakokiri and to leave no impression at all on the oral traditions of other tribes. And since Ngati Tumatakokiri eventually disappeared without recording their recollections and understanding of what they saw in Taitapu in December 1642, those insights were lost to history forever. Nor was Tasman himself much better recalled 3.5 centuries later by Pakeha New Zealanders or the descendants of his fellow countrymen, though they at least had narratives based on his journal by which to remember him. They also had, in the land he discovered for Europe, mountains, a glacier, and one national park named after him. But only 3 of the place names he bestowed survive on the map of modern New Zealand, and the few discrete memorials commemorating his offshore movements there appear to be in the wrong places. Even a statue raised to his memory by the Dutch community in New Zealand in 2000 had been recycled from an earlier exhibition in Barcelona. Like James Cook, the navigator who eventually followed him into that same corner of the southwest Pacific, Tasman was largely unprivileged and worked his way up the ranks from common sailor by virtue of what he learned at sea. Unlike Cook, however, the Dutchman was never perceived as a hero or a role model for other mariners. The best that can be said of, and for him perhaps, is the verdict of John Beaglehole, the great historian of the European exploration of the Pacific and citizen of the country Tasman discovered for the wider world. Greatness is a relative term, and one would not wish to bestow it upon Tasman unmodified. He was not a great leader. He has left no legend. Of his character, indeed, we know but little. Rough, probably, well salted from the southern sprays, eyes set in a skin seamed with intent gazing, with a voice that had borrowed more from the tempest than from converse with the polite. Probably he was respected more than loved by his subordinates. But respect he must have, the respect due to at least first-rate professional competence.